What we're going to do now, rather than discussing whether the current format is good or bad, which we've talked about this way more than enough now, let's talk about the decks in the current format, because there's a YCS this upcoming weekend. I want to talk about the format. I don't want to make a tier list right now, simply because I personally have not tested the current format enough yet, but I want to break down what's happening in the current format, what kind of decks you should expect to see at the YCS, whether you're going to play in it or watch it or whatever, like just for a better understanding of the format right now. I have looked at some of the past YCSs that have already happened in Age of Overlord. I've taken some deck lists from it that we're going to look at today. I'm just going to give you guys my opinion on current decks in the format. This is probably going to be a YouTube video, so if you're seeing this on YouTube, you know, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment down below of what you think of this form of content. Before we hop into specific deck lists for specific decks and what I think about the decks, let's look at some of the meta breakdowns of recent events, most notably YCS Indianapolis and YCS Santa Cruz. And at this point, I want to give a shout out to Dual Chronicles and yugioh Pro Deck, because that's where I got most of these lists and statistics from. I'm going to link those in the description down below as well. So this was the breakdown for YCS Indianapolis, which was the very first YCS after Age of Overlord released, and it had Sinful Spoils Rescue Ace in very dominant position in top cut. 37.5% in top 32 is massive in a format that was supposed to be super diverse, right? Other than that, we had your obvious choices: Pearly, Tierliament, Unchained. Way less than at YCS Dortmund though, which was the last YCS before Age of Overlord. And then we also have Manium and some Sprite doing decently well. And then we had YCS Santa Cruz, where we are missing a decent amount of coverage from the event because it was not very well covered by Konami. We only know half of the top cut here, but Rescue Ace did not perform as strongly as they did in Indianapolis. We still have Unchained, Tier, Manium, Pearly, those kind of decks in top cut, as well as Mikanko winning the event, which is, I think, somewhat of a sleeper pick going into YCS Richmond, and I'm going to show you the list and talk about it in a second as well. Let's talk about Rescue Ace first. This is the list of Steven Santoli that won YCS Indianapolis. Congrats to Steven. I want to talk about why I think what is good about Rescue Ace right now and what is maybe not so good about Rescue Ace, but mainly explaining why it was able to perform well in an environment that was super diverse, which was YCS Indianapolis. And I think Rescue Ace as a deck has a couple things going for it that are really nice for a super diverse format like this one, because as you will notice from this list is it is relatively ignorant as to what you're playing against. What I mean by that is the Turbulence setup is so powerful that it doesn't matter what deck you're playing against, which is valuable when you have a format where there's a lot of different decks. So being able to kind of just ignore that and just, you know, do your thing and win with it is pretty powerful. And the reason why I think that is because this deck is able to choose to play non-engine in the form of Ash, Valor, Imperm, which are good non-engine, don't get me wrong, but they are typically less impactful than cards like, you know, Nibiru, Droll, Dark Ruler, Thrust, Talons. And the reason why Rescue Ace gets away with it is because they don't need to completely stop your opponent from playing. You don't need to Droll and Lockbird your opponent out of playing completely, because your deck is powerful enough to go head to head with engine against most other decks as long as you stop them from doing their full combo, right? Now, the deck still gets to side deck those specific cards, like we still see Nib, Shifter, Droll in the side deck here, but in the main deck, it doesn't seem like Rescue Ace is dependent on its non-engine to carry the matchup, which is a good thing. Believe it or not, it's a good thing that you get to play weaker but more consistent non-engine in Rescue Ace. So I think Rescue Ace is well positioned in a diverse format, and I think it is very well positioned to perform well at YCS Richmond. I think we're going to see a decent amount of people play Rescue Ace and do well with Rescue Ace, because one thing you have to realize is after putting up such a showing at YCS Indianapolis, I think a lot of people are going to be inclined to try the deck and maybe bring it to the YCS because of that, which could lead to some sort of snowballing effect, right? Because the more people play the deck, the more likely it is to also perform well, right? On another note, a performance like this though could also lead to people preparing better for Rescue Ace, right? Because I'm sure everyone was somewhat prepared for Rescue Ace before YCS Indy, but after the performance that it did have at that YCS, I'm sure people are going to be way more prepared. Like if I'm building a deck right now for a YCS, whether I'm playing Rescue Ace myself or I'm playing a different deck, Rescue Ace is the #1 priority on my list. My deck needs to have a good plan against Rescue Ace, right? Keep that in mind with these kind of meta trends. Rescue Ace is something that people will expect. If you don't have a plan for Rescue Ace, then you should maybe overthink what you're doing for the YCS. Another thing about Rescue Ace is that it does play a lot of cards that you don't want to draw. I believe that is one of the reasons why it was okay to go slightly over 40 with this deck. Steven Santoli chose to play 42 cards, drawing your one of Rescue Ace spell and traps that you don't really want to draw just slightly less often throughout a long event. It can go a long way. It can definitely make the difference in like 1 or 2 or 3 games. So Rescue Ace overall, good position. The more I think about it, the less I am surprised by its performance at YCS Indy. Whether it can carry on and ride the wave of success for YCS Richmond is something that remains to be seen, but I think it definitely is one of the top contenders going into the event. Another thing that was kind of like one of the biggest things from the previous format was Unchained, and it still is performing decently well. I'm using an example top 32 list from YCS Indy here as well. One downside for this deck, even more than the Rescue Ace deck, this deck has a lot of cards that you don't want to draw. A lot of cards that can really ruin your day. And it's not really in your control, right? If you're playing Unchained, you have to put those cards into the deck. I don't think it's correct to not play the Vice King, for example. I think you have to play those cards. The only one that is like not mandatory is the Blue Dog, which is in the side deck here. And then, you know, it's just variance, right? If you go through an 11 or 12 round YCS and you draw these cards too often, you're not going to feel great about it. If you don't draw them very often, it's going to be very powerful, right? Otherwise, I think Unchained is relatively similar to Rescue Ace because it is a deck that can perform relatively well into a variety of decks because the Unchained engine is definitely strong enough to outgrind almost any deck in the format, especially going first. I still like Unchained a lot, and I do expect it to still be played and perform decently well at YCS Richmond. It does suffer a little bit from the fact that some decks in the format can make Abyss Dweller. Steven didn't play it, but there is versions of Rescue Ace that can make rank 4s and that have the Dweller in the extra deck to just auto-win matchups like Unchained and Tierliaments, and that is one thing to keep in mind when you're playing Unchained. Speaking of the devil, Tierliaments, top 16 YCS Indy Joshua Kippenberg. Compared to its performance at YCS Dortmund, I would say it has fallen off a decent amount. I think Tier suffers a decent amount from the popularity of a couple cards in the format right now. One of those cards is Dimension Shifter. Dimension Shifter used to be only really played in decks that didn't care about it at all, right? In the current format, it seems to be a trend. As long as your deck works better under Shifter than your opponent's deck, you can play Shifter. Rescue Ace, first place. Even though it suffers from Shifter, it suffers less from Shifter than the Tierliament opponent, right? I even saw some Unchained people play Shifter in the past. I think Pack played Shifter in Pearly. Sprite is a deck that used to do that as well. Yeah, Shifter Sprite used to do that in Tierliament format. Because Tierliament came back into the scene with such a bang at YCS Dortmund, so did Shifter. And Tierliaments, even though it is a powerful deck, it's not as ignorant anymore as it used to be in like tier 0 Ishizu tier format. So while it can perform, I think Tierliaments are definitely somewhat on the decline. Now, I still expect people to play it because it is also a deck that people just love to play. It's a very fun deck to play, I think. And it does have some good matchups still. Pearly is a very decent matchup for the deck. Unchained is also a decent matchup for the deck. It's decently well positioned in the format. It's just, it suffers a lot from the choices that people have been making. The non-engine hurts Tier a decent amount. Pearly, this is the 3rd place list from YCS Indianapolis. It's a very standard list. It has the standard Pearly ratios with only 2 field spells, and then you get room for 18 other cards. I personally think that cards like Droll and Lockbird and Nibiru are better off in the side deck. However, Pearly is a deck that can discard them, right? If you're playing a matchup where Nib or Droll are completely dead, you can pitch them for a Pearly spell. That can be one advantage for playing a Pearly deck, is like you get to play those cards in your main deck with not that much risk attached to it, right? I mean, my biggest issue with Pearly when I brought it to YCS Dortmund was not that my deck wasn't good, it was just that the deck kept having issues with time, which they did fix in this list by playing the Condemned Dark Lord. I will say a lot of decks have been having out to Noir. Some decks also didn't. You look at the winning deck from the YCS, it didn't have a real out to Noir, right? Your only way to out Noir here is to stop it from coming down by throwing hand traps at your opponent, right? And so if you can still make a Noir, this deck does have a problem. So Pearly, because it's been kind of chilling in that like 3rd, 4th, 5th best deck position, has been starting to get less and less attention in deck building, right? One trend in these deck lists here is that Thrust is on the decline a little bit. You know, Thrust in Unchained used to be like a 3 of main deck card. Now it's like barely main deck. Like there's only 2 copies total in this list. First place didn't play it at all. This Tierliament deck is only siding it, and that is something that can benefit Pearly. You'll notice that I say this about a lot of the decks, right? A lot of the decks are okay to play. I think it's going to be somewhat arbitrary. Like the format is very wide. Like a lot of decks I do like. I think I like Pearly and Rescue Ace more than I like Tier and Unchained right now, out of the 4 that we've already covered. These 2 decks don't lose to Dweller in the same fashion that these 2 do, which is a thing in the format, and the non-engine that people are playing isn't as good against Pearly right now, is the feeling that I'm getting. I think Pearly is in a solid spot. The Manium deck, I wanted to include it. I don't love this deck, but I also don't hate it at the same time. It's incredibly dangerous. A deck that you should at least familiarize yourself with. I don't think I would recommend you guys to play the deck. I think there is maybe better options out there. I think past events have shown that the deck can definitely keep up with the current form. Keep in mind, I have not tested a lot of Manium yet. It's just an impression. I think the deck is powerful. I don't think I would play it. Definitely some people will, and it is not a bad deck, for sure. The Manium deck, I think, is one of the stronger Game 1 decks in the format, right? Because you go first, your opponent is not likely to have the correct answers to it, because Ash, Valor, Imperm are probably not consistently stopping this deck from playing when it gets to go first. But after siding, you know, people are going to have Droll, people are going to have Nib, and that can be a little bit more problematic, I would say. So even if you get an easy win in Game 1, you're still going to have to struggle against those cards in Game 2 and 3, right? And so I think that's kind of a trade-off. Now we're getting into more of the, like, sleeper picks, right? Like, I would say, if you're preparing for a YCS right now, Rescue Ace, Unchained, Tier, Pearly, those are like the top 4 decks, and then Manium is like a close 5th. Top decks to prepare for. And then now we're getting into more like, you might play 1 or 2 of this in Swiss at the YCS, right? I wouldn't expect more than that, but you should at least familiarize yourself maybe with the deck and maybe have a plan for it in your side deck. At least know what to do against it, you know, those kind of things, right? And that's why I included this Horus Bestial deck, because it did actually not only top YCS Indy, it also topped YCS Santa Cruz. It did do some stuff in the format. The new Horus cards have been put to decent use here. The new Resonator cards have been put to good use here. It was a cool deck to watch, honestly. You look at this deck, and most of it is engine, right? You have 3 Ash, 3 Crow, 3 Imperm, and 2 Talents as your non-engine. That's a fine number. It's decent. But then, if you play against a deck that relies on light and darks in the graveyard, suddenly your non-engine number jumps up a crazy amount, which has always been the case, right? It's just so much. Suddenly, you're playing a deck with like 18 non-engine or something like that. I think the power of this deck just comes down to how good are Bestials in the current format. Bestials are good against Tier, good against Unchained, against like the rest of the format. They have uses, but I don't think they hit anything super hard. It settles somewhere in Tier 2. If there was more Tier and more Unchained, it'd be a better meta call. The way it is, it feels like you're kind of gambling, right? This is not about whether this is the best list possible for all of these decks. I just wanted to include example deck lists for what I'm talking about, because I feel like it gives it more structure when we talk about certain decks. I included a Vanquish Soul list that did win a regional, I believe. I like Vanquish Soul a lot. I think it's a cool deck, besides the summon limits. I don't want to talk about the summon limits. It did get support with Yugioh Long in Age of Overlord. That's why I decided to include it. All the signs from the recent YCSs speak for the fact that the new card doesn't make it a top tier contender, because other decks have just been performing way better than Vanquish Soul. Still, it pops up here and there. It's relatively expensive, which is like one thing I don't like about it, because otherwise I would tell people to play it more, because it's like a very fun tier 2 strategy. But with the price tag that it has, I just have a hard time, you know, recommending it to people. I wish it was a little bit more consistent, because that's my issue with it. I think Yugioh Long doesn't fix the deck's consistency issues. Like if you don't open Raisin, you still have a problem. But if you open Raisin, your deck is now a lot more powerful, because you just never run out of cards, right? As soon as you assemble a bunch of the Vanquish Souls, you just cycle through all of their effects every turn. So I think Vanquish Soul, prior to Age of Overlord, had 2 problems. One of them, consistency. Second, the ceiling was relatively low for Vanquish Soul, unless you drew insane hands. I think the ceiling is fixed now with Yugioh Long at the trap card. Consistency, not so much, especially going second. When your opponent has interruptions for your Raisin, even if you draw it, I think consistency is a little bit of an issue. But overall, I like the deck. I think it's cool. I think you can tell by the amount of time I'm spending on it that I am a fan of Vanquish Soul. I wish I could tell you it's a top tier contender. I don't think it's top tier. I'd say it's like playable. Honorable mentions, Branded Chimera is a deck that was decently popular, has received support in Age of Overlord, yet it still has fallen off a little bit. I found this deck from, I think, the same regional that the Vanquish Soul deck won. It's worth noting that they can now floodgate your opponents more effectively because you can send like End of Anubis or King Tiger Vangu to the graveyard from your deck and then revive it with different means, right? So it's like kind of Troll Despair in some ways. I think the deck is also like a solid tier 2. I think it's the better version of Branded right now because the cool thing about this deck is that it has multiple choke points into Ash as opposed to just Branded Fusion. That's the one thing that sticks out to me. So that's one thing I like about it. I wouldn't recommend to play it, even though I don't hate it, but I definitely recommend practicing against it because I do think it is a respectable part of the format. There's a lot of decks in this kind of position, but I think Branded Chimera was worth like an honorable mention when we're talking about the format. Rika still does Rika things. It topped YCS Indy as well. It won YCS Dortmund. You guys know I don't like the way this deck plays. You guys know I don't like the approach of going turn 1 combo, auto win the game, but that doesn't mean it's bad, right? Even though I wish I could tell you that that's a bad thing. I think it's even the opposite in a format that is relatively diverse. It's good to have a deck that's like kind of ignorant to whatever deck your opponent is playing, right? Doesn't matter. If you resolve the Rika combo, you win. One downside for Rika though, I want to say, if you've paid attention to these deck lists that we've looked at, a lot of hand traps in main decks and a lot of Droll and Nib in the side deck. Almost every single deck had those cards in it somewhere. And Rika does struggle against those cards. I think Rika is a deck that you can make a good meta call with a deck like this if you ever catch people not playing enough hand traps. I don't think right now is the time for it, so I don't think it's a particularly great meta call, but I think it can still perform into a super like diverse format. I think it's in a somewhat similar position as Manium, not much different. Once again, I don't want to not include decks just because I don't like them. I don't like Flu, but I do think Shifter is a hell of a card right now, and not caring about it is powerful. The deck is weak to Droll, but I think the deck also has phenomenal ways to deal with Droll because there's no worse feeling than having Droll in your hand and then one of two things happen. First thing, your opponent drops Shifter, you can't Droll. The other thing is freaking thrust into said Featherstorm. Flu has one of the most powerful first turn thrusts in the game because of Featherstorm. If you Droll them, you still lose. And so that is why I think Flu deserves an honorable mention. I don't see many people having any targeted hate for Flu in the decks, which is a problem. And you can't really have targeted hate at Flu. Like, it's not correct to play Zombie World in your deck or something like that when there's like 20 decks in the format and Flu is just like maybe number 15 most represented or whatever. I wouldn't expect anyone to have super targeted hate for Flu in their deck right now. This list going first has triple Shifter, triple Thrust after siding for the Featherstorm, triple Featherstorm itself that they can hard draw to skip your turn back if you Droll them, and Called By. Basically 10 answers to Droll and Lockbird, as long as they don't brick. On top of the fact that this deck in the TCG still has triple Empen, triple Field Spell, triple Prosp, triple Duality, I think Flu is scary. I kept the most interesting one for last, and I want to just say one thing real fast. I said that I was impressed by this deck, and people commented like crazy, like, how are you hating on decks like Plants or Mathmech with like one card win the game combos, and then you like this deck because it also just makes Acid Golem and auto wins the game, right? The actual playstyle, I do agree with you, is problematic. Giving your opponent an Acid Golem, it's not a cool way to win the game. I just couldn't help but admire the creativity that went into this deck, because the reason I like this deck in terms of like its power in the current format is I think it's a deck that goes first very well because it's a Gen and Ken deck with talents and stuff like that. It's a very powerful combo deck for going first, but it has all of those cards that are good for going second as well, right? Because normally those super combo heavy decks have a problem when they go second, but in this deck a lot of your combo is really good cards for going second. Arabesque is a combo starter and a board breaker. Thrust and Talents are combo pieces going first because of Gen and Ken, but also board breakers going second, and I think that's cool. That's more what I like about it rather than its win condition. I don't like its win condition, but I like the way the deck is constructed. I just wanted to make that clear. The Mikanko deck won YCS Santa Cruz. It was popularized first by Deception at YCS Indianapolis, who barely missed out on top 32. I think it's a deck that some people will mess around with after the YCS performance in Santa Cruz, and I could see it being successful at YCS Richmond. And that is all of the decks that I wanted to include. There's probably more out there. So what we're going to do, in case you're watching this on YouTube, we're going to do the same thing that we usually do with tier lists. Now, this wasn't a tier list, but it was a format discussion. If there's a deck that you think is really powerful right now, or you wonder what's going on, leave it in the comments down below and I'll try to answer it and let you know what I think of specific decks for the current format. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know in the comments down below whether you liked this kind of video. This kind of discussion always helps me to gather some feedback of how you enjoyed a certain type of video so I can make more of that in the future. Until then, you know, have a wonderful rest of your day. Say goodbye to YouTube, Twitch chat, and yeah, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye. Thanks for watching. Peace.